All right, thank you, Jackie, and good morning, everyone. And yeah, thanks to Jackie and Megan behind the scenes for doing the great work that they're doing and getting these webinars running all season. Thanks so much for joining us today. I hope you're healthy and well. And as magic would have it, not only are we talking about spring flowers today, but the talented team at the BTC has also provided the beautiful spring weather. So I have the great pleasure of introducing our panelists today. And I've said this before, but it's very true. I'm lucky to work with these talented folks every day. So first up, Adam Brylowski is our Manager of Conservation and Trail. He's been with the Bruce Trail Conservancy for over 10 years. Adam has a background in urban forestry and ecological restoration, a Bachelor of Environmental Studies from York University, and a postgrad certificate in ecosystem restoration from Niagara College. Prior to working for the BTC, Adam worked at the Forestry Department at the City of Toronto as a natural resource management technician, as well at an organization called Urban Forest Associates that work to restore degraded natural spaces in Toronto. So welcome, Adam. And Brian is our talented land stewardship coordinator who utilizes, I can't speak today. I think the sunshine's affecting me, I'm sorry. He's utilizing his years of experience to perform ecological inventories on over 13,000 acres of BTC managed land and prepare management plans for BTC properties, as well as support BTC clubs in stewardship, encroachment, and ecological issues. Brian holds a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science and Biology from Trent University, as well as certificates in ecological land classification, bird and plant identification, butternut assessment, Ontario pesticide forestry license, and Ontario wetland evaluation. Brian can often be found in the forest in the watersheds of Ontario, hiking, fishing, taking pictures, camping, and simply enjoying nature's beauty. So Adam and Brian, welcome, and over to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Michael. So I'm Brian, part of the Brian and Adam show. And so today we're going to appropriately talk about some spring wildflowers that you can observe along the Niagara Escarpment and the Bruce Trail. So we're going to focus on spring ephemerals. So these are basically defined as a wildflower that grows and blooms in the early spring, usually in April and May. So these wildflowers are often seen only for a brief time and spanning just a few weeks. So basically, as the sun shines through the canopy, there's no leaves on the canopy at that time. So it hits the forest floor and it warms up the soil. So these spring wildflowers, they really take advantage of this extra light at this time, and they grow really, really fast. And they have very showy flowers to attract the insects, so they can be pollinated. Lots of these spring wildflowers, they're actually pollinated by ants at this time of year, but there's lots of other pollinators that help out. So there's also less competition at this time from other plants. So it's a really great time for these spring ephemerals to really pop up and take advantage of the spring sunshine. So I will mention there are some plants in this presentation that are not really defined as spring ephemerals, but they also bloom in the early spring, just that sometimes they have a longer blooming period. So you might find them blooming into late May and June. So going back to spring ephemerals, so their habitat basically consists of the understory of deciduous and mixed broadleaf conifer forests. So they're mostly perennials and they are dormant for most of the year. So basically what happens is they pop up in the spring, collect all that energy from the sun, produce their seeds and berries, and then the foliage and the flowers die off. And by June, middle of June, you don't even know that they've existed. The flowers are gone and their leaves have fell off and become part of the forest biodiversity of the forest floor. So they do require like high light and water and nutrient conditions to grow. So, they're very picky on where they grow. And there's, certain areas in our ecosystem that these plants need to grow. So they won't grow if you dig them up, plant them in your garden. It's unlikely that they're going to grow because they need that deciduous or mixed forest environment. So they grow and they fruit during the period between the snow melt and just before the forest trees canopy is in full growth. So it's about between 40 and 60 days. So they're very well adapted to absorb water and nutrients to promote very quick growth. Some invasive plant species are examples, garlic mustard. They can actually threaten spring ephemeral populations by outcompeting them for nutrients. And they also contribute greatly to the forest biodiversity, even though they only grow for a short period of the year. So when they kind of die off and their leaves and flowers start to degrade in the forest floor, it really adds to the forest litter and adds nutrients. So other plants who kind of flower later in the year, they use the nutrients from the dead spring ephemerals for their own energy. So spring ephemerals are very, very important for pollinators. As you know, they're among the first flowers to bloom. So many pollinators, such as birds, bats, or insects, they rely on this nectar to survive when other food sources are scarce. When the temperature warms up and the sun's shining, not only do the wildflowers start to bloom, but the insects, they come out from under the bark, under their wintering areas, and they need food. So these wildflowers are very important for these insects as they kind of awaken from their winter slumber. So for some species, these plants are essential. There's some species of bumblebees have been found, they actually choose their nesting site based on the proximity to spring ephemerals. So a lot of bumblebees, they actually winter underground. They have little burrows. So they make their burrows nearby populations where they know when they come out, there's going to be some trilliums, some trout lilies or something so they can feed on. So some insects almost solely feed on certain plants. So there is a bee, for instance, called the Trout Lily mining bee, that it has been found to have higher populations in areas near patches of trout lily. So they're very, very dependent on certain species of wildflower. So next, we just started describing what a spring ephemeral is and their importance to pollinators and to the environment. So how about we get into some of these flowers? So our first one here, this is the Virginia Spring Beauty. So it's got very long linear leaves, and it's possibly one of the first wildflowers that will pop up when you see it. It's a very small flower, so its flowers are showy, but the plant itself is small. So it produces like white flowers that are veined with pink. So if you look at the picture, you can see the little delicate veins of pink. That kind of, what they do is they kind of direct toward the center of the flower. So it's thought that what that does is insects are coming in to pollinate that flower. Those pink veins actually direct the insects to the center of the flower where the pollen is. So it's pretty interesting how these plants have adapted. Its distribution, so it is a more southern species, so it's not likely to be seen north of Toronto. And just a fun fact, like I said, it's one of the earliest to flower, and they are often found next to trees, because it's been found that the brownish bark of trees actually absorbs more of the sun, and it's a little bit warmer around the base of a tree. So a lot of times you'll see these little plants popping up right at the base of a tree. And if you can see down at the lower photo, that's exactly where that little plant is growing, actually between the tree roots. So we got another spring beauty. This one's called Carolina Spring Beauty. So the difference is basically in the shape of the leaves. So you can see that they're a little bit wider and they're more elliptical. Same type of flowers. They're white with nice little delicate pink veins, and there are 5 petals. Same type of seed capsule. So the thing is with this species is it's more of a northern species. So you can find it in the southern sections, but when you move north, this is the exclusive spring beauty that you find, say up in the Sydenham section up on the Bruce Peninsula. It's very, very rare to find a Virginia spring beauty up that high north. So if you're up in those sections and you see a spring beauty, it's going to be the Carolina. So yeah, so the roots, very important, not only for pollinators, but eastern chipmunks and white-footed mice love to eat the roots of these plants. So here's just a comparison photo. So you have the Virginia to your left, and then the Carolina. So you can see the difference basically in the leaf structure. So once you get to learn this, it's pretty easy to tell them apart. Cut leaf toothwort. So it's an interesting plant. As you can see, the leaves are kind of long and slender. I call it strap-like leaves. They have pretty big teeth along the edge of the leaf. Once again, the flowers are white, and they also have pink veins. 5 petals, but more of a closed flower structure, whereas the spring beauties, you can see it, they were more open. This is more of a closed flower structure. So it produces a round capsule that contains a few round seeds. Once again, this is more of a southern species, not likely to be seen north of Toronto. You do see them, but they're not as rare as the Virginia spring beauty, but you do see them sometimes up north. And toothworts are a very important plant for a rare butterfly in Ontario, which is called the West Virginia white butterfly. So much like the monarch lays its eggs on milkweed, the West Virginia white butterfly exclusively lays its eggs on toothwort. So a very important species for this butterfly. If we lose this plant, guess what? We lose the West Virginia white butterfly. So just for comparison, there's 2 other toothwort species, that you'll find along the Bruce Trail. The one to your left is very, very common. It's found all along the trail. It's called 2-leaf toothwort. So you can see its leaf structure there are a lot broader leaves. The cut leaf has slim lobes, I guess you call it, whereas the 2-leaf toothwort has much wider lobed leaves. And like I said, very, very common. Pretty much you'll see this plant in any deciduous woodlot that you walk through. So the one to your right, that's called large toothwort. And it's actually a rare species. It's not a species at risk, but we call it a species of conservation concern because there's not much of them found. So blue cohash, sorry, I'm starting to lose my voice. Blue cohash is another very common species. This one there's 2 species of blue cohash. So this one has yellow flowers, and the flowers kind of come out when the leaves have unfolded. So the leaves unfold and then the flowers pop. So the leaves start out as very deep purple and they turn green as they unfold. And they have 3 irregular leaflets, so you can see in the pictures. So the flowers are 6 petal. In this species, like I said, they're yellowish to green yellow. Produces a nice greenish berry, but then that berry ripens to a blueberry. So it's very important that you don't mistake these for blueberries because they are actually poisonous to people. And once again, it's found all along the trail, but it seems to lessen as you get up to the Sydenham Peninsula sections. So here's the other species of cohash. This is giant blue cohash. This one is very, very common, and it's the more common species up in the Sydenham and Peninsula sections. Pretty much identical to the previous species I just talked about. So the difference is in the color of the flowers. So this one has purple to purple brown flowers, as you can see in the pictures. And they appear before the leaves expand. So if you can see in the pictures that show the leaves are still folded and the flowers are present. So it's sometimes very tricky when you're looking at wildflowers. Like here you have species that look so very similar, and there's just little identifying tricks that you have to use to tell them apart. Myself and Adam, we always laugh at this species because as the leaves emerge from the ground, they actually look like little zombie hands popping up out of a graveyard or something. So we always love seeing these little zombie hands popping up. So now we're going to move to our trilliums. So I think everyone is familiar with what a trillium looks like, but a lot of people don't know that there's actually 4 species that you can actually find along the Bruce Trail. In Ontario, there's more species than 4, but these are the ones that you'll find, along the Niagara Escarpment. So we'll start off with the white trillium. And once again, I don't think anybody needs any tips on how to identify a white trillium. It's got its distinctive whorl of 3 wide leaves, and it's got the 3 white petals. Usually have little ruffled edges. Oh, lost my light. And you can still see me. So once the flower's done fruiting, it has these little reddish, roundish pods, and they're usually drooping from where the flower used to be. White trillium is probably one of the most common species all along the trail. It can be found in Niagara all the way up to Tobermory. You can see carpets and carpets of these in some areas where the whole forest floor just looks white from these beautiful white trilliums. It's the official flower of Ontario, which appropriately so, because it is so common. So the flowers can actually turn as they age like a rosy pink color. And so a lot of times people think that's a different species of trillium, or they think it's a red trillium. So in fact, it's just a white trillium. Just with age, the flowers tend to turn that rosy pink. And there's also a microscopic organism that actually infects trilliums and causes some of the petals to be green. So if you do see a green trillium, it's not a different species. It's a white trillium. It just happens to be affected by this microscopic organism. And sometimes the petals can be fully green. Sometimes there'll be streaks of green, but it's really neat if you're lucky enough to see one of these green flowered trilliums. So the red trillium, probably the second most common trillium that you're going to find along the Niagara Escarpment. Once again, I think very easy to identify. Looks very much like the white trillium, only it's got these reddish maroon petals instead of the white petals. You also find, if you look at the picture to the right, the leaves in red trillium tend to be like bigger and wider and fatter. So if the flower's not present, sometimes you can identify it by just looking at the leaves. Same type of fruit. It's got this little reddish, roundish, drooping pod. So this is also found all along the trail, but you tend to find red trilliums more in more acidic environments. So we find these a lot in mixed forest where there's both deciduous and coniferous trees, because the needles from the coniferous trees add more acidity to the soil. So a lot of times you'll find the red trillium, a little bit more abundant under coniferous or mixed forest. So this is a neat flower as well, because this trillium, the smell, if you kneel down and smell it actually stinks. Just a very slight hint of like a rotting animal smell. So what that does is it attracts flesh flies and carrion beetles. So this flower is really adapted, its scent to attract certain type of insects. So it almost guarantees that it's going to get pollinated. Painted trillium. So this is probably my favorite trillium. Once again, it looks like a trillium. The difference is it has a little pink, almost circle in the center of the flower. In regards to size, it's a little bit smaller than your red and white Trillium. We've actually only observed this species once along the Bruce Trail. And myself and Adam, we get out a lot on Bruce Trail properties. And so probably about 8 years ago, we observed it once on a property in the Beaver Valley. And funny enough, when we first observed it, there was only 3 or 4 stems. So since going back, say 7 years later, the population has expanded to almost 30 to 40 different stems. So the population is doing very, very well. Yeah, it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous Trillium to find. Don't ask me where it is, because we kind of keep it a secret, because it's not a rare plant in Ontario, but it seems to be rare along the Niagara Escarpment. So yeah, we tend to protect it. So like most Trilliums, the seeds have a fleshy structure that is rich in lipids and protein. So this basically, what this does, it attracts ants. And so what the ants do is they love the little fleshy structure. So they pick it off and they carry it to their nest, bring it down into their nest. And what they do is they eat the lipids and the protein and basically discard the seed. And that helps allow the Trillium populations to spread, throughout the forest floor, wherever the ants are. So nodding Trillium. So this is another one. It's not rare, but it's uncommon along the Niagara Escarpment. To be honest, I've never seen this flower. I do know there's observations that have been reported on iNaturalist up in the northern sections, like the Bruce Peninsula. It seems to be more of a northeastern species. So if you go towards Peterborough in that area, it's a lot more common. Once again, very, very similar to the other Trilliums, only its distinction is that if you look at the flower, it nods, which hence the name nodding Trillium. Most of the other Trillium species, their flowers are kind of point up toward the sun, and this one has a really nodding feature. So the flowers actually sometimes are hidden by the leaves. And then the other difference is, if you look at the center, the anthers of the flower in the center, they have a pinkish hue, whereas the normal white Trillium, the anthers will be yellow. So that's another distinctive identifying feature of this plant. So that's it for our Trilliums. So I'm going to throw it over to Adam, and he's going to carry on with some other wildflowers.
Thank you very much, Brian. And yeah, just like to echo the fact that this is such a great day for a spring wildflowers discussion and webinar. So I hope everyone's going to get out and go searching for flowers, although it's a little too early right now. So yeah, I'll take over a Trout Lily here. And yellow Trout Lily is a species that everyone's probably seen, and you'll notice that it actually carpets the forest floor for a brief period of time in the spring. The leaves, it has 1 to 2 leaves per plant. They're generally stiff and upright, although sometimes you can see them lying flat on the ground, but they're speckled like a trout, which where it gets its namesake. So it looks sort of like speckled trout on the side of the leaves. The flowers are bright yellow with 6 petals, and they're singular. And as you can see, they open up during the day. The picture to the left is the open version of the flower. The picture to the right is when the flower is closed. So you'll see them in both forms. The fruit, similar to Trilliums, as Brian was mentioning, the fruit is a capsule. It's oval to inverted egg shape, and it's rounded at the tip, but it also has, it's covered or coated in a sort of protein that's attracts ants. And just like the Trilliums, ants will take these seeds back to their places, their ant colonies, and eat off all the good stuff and then discard the seeds, generally in some sort of waste pile that has high nutrients because it's filled with other discarded materials, and that helps to increase the population. In terms of distribution, you can find Trout Lily, yellow Trout Lily, all along the trail. It's very, very common, albeit it is somewhat fleeting in the spring. And one thing that's kind of interesting about this species is that because it is it's a lily, it's a bulb, it could be over 100 years old. The colony of trout lilies itself could be over 100 years. So it comes back over and over and over again. Bloodroot is another great spring ephemeral, and not only is it a beautiful flower, but it has an interesting characteristic, which I'll get into. The leaves themselves are rounded and with sort of large, broad tooths along the edges, with deep lobes going through the leaf as well. The flowers are white with 8 to 10 petals, as you can see on the right there. Beautiful flowers. And when it fruits, it's sort of a spindle-shaped capsule about 1 inch long. And you can see this all along the trail. And the reason it became known as bloodroot is because if you do pick up the root, if you dig up the root of the plant, which I do not recommend, please do not do this. But if you're doing it for science, it does bleed red sap, which looks very, very similar to blood, to our human blood. But it is in fact poisonous. So there's no eating bloodroot for anyone. Thank you. And then we're going to move on to large flowered bellwort, which is, again, another somewhat common species that we find along the Bruce Trail. It has alternate leaves, which means that they do not face each other when they're on the stem. So they alternate up along the stem. And at the base of each leaf, it's perfoliate, which means that it completely surrounds the stem. So instead of the leaf being attached directly at one edge of the stem, it completely encases the stem. So that's a very distinct characteristic for this species. The flowers as well, they're yellow bell-shaped flowers, and they usually hang from a single stem. So they're sort of dangling downwards, which is a little bit different from the other ephemerals that you'll be seeing this time of year, except for the nodding trillium, which we've never seen. The fruit itself is a 3-section capsule. Looks like an inverted pyramid with rounded corners. It's a very interesting shape. And as I mentioned, this is distributed all along the trail. A fun fact about large flowered bellwort is that it's heavily grazed by deer, and it's known to decline in abundance when there's an overpopulation of deer. So this is high on the list for the deer buffet in the springtime. And now we've got Dutchman's breeches, which is one of 2 species that are very easily misidentified or confused with each other. The other one being squirrel corn, which we'll get to next. But Dutchman breeches itself, it has somewhat of a fern-like leaf where the leaves are very finely divided with deep cuts into the leaf. The flowers are white or slightly yellow, and then they have spreading wings or a pant-like shape, which is where it got its name as Dutchman's breeches. So if you look at the flower to the right and you imagine it upside down, it sort of looks like a pair of old style breeches or underwear that people would wear years and years ago. The fruit is a bean-like capsule that tapers at both ends. Again, this is distributed all along the trail. And the foliage is toxic to certain mammals, so it's not often eaten by them. And then the other similar species is squirrel corn. Again, the leaves are somewhat fern-like, very finely divided, as you can kind of see in that picture to the left there. The flowers are white and they're heart-shaped, so they don't have that pantaloon type look. I'll go back real quick, of the Dutchman's breeches. You can see the difference in flower shape. The fruit itself is a bean-like capsule, which is tapered at both ends, very similar to Dutchman's breeches. It's also distributed along the trail, and it's also toxic in large quantities. Skunk cabbage is another species that you may have seen and been confused with, because it looks a little strange when it's starting to come up out of the ground early in the spring. As you can see in the top right corner, that picture there almost looks otherworldly. So when it finally does come out, it has large green leaves that look somewhat like cabbage, and its flowers are a spike-like structure called a spadix, which are inside a purple structure called a spathe, which you can see in the picture there. The fruit itself is a round to oval compound fruit, meaning there's more than one sort of piece of fruit in the entire fruit. And it's more of a southern plant. So it's found in swamps and beside rivers, marshes, that kind of thing. It's not too common north of the Caledon section of the Bruce Trail. And so this is actually one of the first plants to bloom, and sometimes it blooms as early as late January. So it's a very, very hardy plant. And it does actually, if you've ever walked through a patch of skunk cabbage, you may have noticed that there is a bit of a scent to it. It has a skunk-like scent to it, hence the name. Another wet type or wet loving plant is marsh marigold. So this plant has large, round, kidney-shaped leaves that are sort of deeply heart-shaped at the base. Very bright, vibrant, showy colors. The petals are 5 to 9 petals of these yellow, beautiful flowers. And when they turn into fruit, it's a curved capsule. It's initially green, dries to a light greenish or brown color. And this species is also found along the entire section of the trail, near watercourses and wetlands, sort of like shallow marshes. It's very, very common. And a fun fact about this species is that unlike its name, it actually is not a marigold, which is in the aster family. It's a buttercup. So it's in the buttercup family. But this is a species that we see very often along the Bruce Trail as we're doing our inventories, ecological inventories. Similar to Jack in the Pulpit. And this is probably a species that most of you are familiar with because it's so distinct looking. The leaves, there's 1 to 2 sets of compound leaves, meaning there's more than one leaflet on each leaf. And there's 3 leaflets on each leaf. So you can see in the bottom left picture there, there's the three leafleted leaves surrounding the seed. The flowers are actually a striped hood that furls around a spike, as you can see on the right there. Very distinct, interesting, different type of flower. And then the fruit, once the flower is pollinated, turns into a bunch of bright red berries, as you can see on the left there. And again, this is a species that's pretty much all along the entire trail. It's very, very common. And one of the interesting theories about this plant is that the reason that the flower developed that way was in order to be somewhat carnivorous and trap insects in the spathe, or that striped hood, in order to sort of benefit from their nutrition. We're moving on to violets. There's a number of different violets that we find along the Bruce Trail. We can't get into all of the differences right now, but generally the violets that we see around here are sort of whitish or blue violet type colored, although there are different colors like the downy yellow violet that we see down here on the bottom. The most common that we're going to find along the Bruce Trail, very easily at least, would be the downy yellow early in the spring, then the common blue violet, and also the long-spurred violet. Those are pretty much found all along the Bruce Trail. One of my personal favorites is the Canada violet to the upper right on the screen here. And that's a white violet, but if you look at the back of the petals, there's a little bit of purpley tinge, some purple lines. So it's just a really neat little interesting characteristic that you can look for to determine what species it is. So I would encourage you to go out and get a plant book and try and figure out what violet it is that you're looking at. Mayapple is another species that's quite distinct looking because it looks like a tiny little umbrella or almost a palm tree that sits, 30 to 50 centimeters in height. The leaves are umbrella-like. They're palmately lobed into 5 to 9 parts. So they have a number of leaflets, again, that sort of come out, making one larger leaf. The flowers are singular, so there's only one flower per plant. They're 6 to 9 petaled flowers, and they're white, and they're generally in the middle of the stem. So if you have a mayapple with 2 branching stems for the leaves, the flower would be in the middle, generally sort of facing down. The fruit turns into a oval berry that ripens to a yellow, and you may have had the experience of eating one of these. I would not recommend it because the seeds in mayapple are toxic. but the flesh of the fruit itself is actually somewhat similar to an apple in texture and almost a grapefruit or a lemon in taste. It's all along the trail as well, so it's a very, very common species. And fun fact, well, the fruit that I just mentioned, it resembles a brain. Yeah, it's very interesting looking. It's very tough to find a ripened fruit of a mayapple, though, because it is such a delicacy to the other woodland critters. So usually the squirrels and raccoons and whatnot have already been there by the time that mayaples are ready to taste. And then there's two different types of Hepaticas, which are also very early species in the spring. They come up quite early. The leaves themselves are very distinct. Again, there's three leaves. It's a single leaf that looks like it's got three lobes. And similar to the Jack in the Pulpit, where you've got that three-leafed structure. However, these are much closer to the ground. They don't grow up, the leaves, as tall as Jack in the Pulpit. They have a hairy stalk, which is very characteristic. Each lobe is generally egg-shaped with a pointed tip as well. So that's also another distinction that we're looking for when we're identifying Hepatica. The flowers are 5 to 12 petal-like sepals, and then the color ranges from violet to white, sometimes pinkish, sometimes a little bit blue. And then once they fruit, there's small, dry, one-seeded fruits called an achene. Again, all along the trail, you can find Hepaticas. However, sharp-lobed Hepatica is more common in the northern sections. A fun fact about these two species is that the roots were used by indigenous people as a charm on traps for mammals. And a compound was given to forest runners to relieve shortness of breath. So most of these are wild plants, have some sort of traditional medicinal value. And it's very interesting to learn about these previous uses. We'll move on to wood anemone here. It's a small, delicate wildflower. It has a whorl of 3 stalked leaves. So a whorl means that each of the leaves come out of the same spot. So it's sort of like a whorl, like a helicopter blade, with deeply lobed leaves. They're divided into 2 or 3 parts, as you can see in the bottom right picture there. The flowers, it's a singular flower for each plant, has 4 to 9 petals, where the leaves attach to the stem. There's a stalk that comes up with a white flower on it. The fruit turns into a round head of beaked oval seeds. And this is generally more of a southern species, so it's not going to be found north of the Toronto section. And a fun fact about this species is that a single plant may take 5 years or longer to flower. So often only a few flowers are seen among the leaves. It takes a while for it to get the strength in its roots to shoot up and actually flower. This is one of my personal favorite species that we see in the springtime, and it really makes me feel like spring is finally here. It's wild leek. The leaves are sort of large, green, oval and waxy looking. You can see to the right, and they are in the garlic family. So they have a bulb that tastes very garlicky. The leaves themselves also taste very garlicky, or like a leek. And depending on your tastes, it might be good or bad. The flowers appear mostly after the leaves have died back, and they're sort of a small round cluster of creamy greenish white flowers on stout stalks. So oftentimes you'll see these flower stalks well past the time that the leaves have curled up and died. The fruit is a 3-celled glossy black capsule after the flowers on the end of the stalk. After they bloom and they're pollinated, they turn into these small little black capsules that if you ever find one, you can sort of roll it around in your fingers and it still has that garlicky leek smell to it that's distinct about the species. This is distributed all along the trail. And I love walking through a forest filled with wild leeks because you get that smell that kind of pops up. And it's come to mean spring to me. So an interesting fact about this is that it's so popular in certain parts of Canada. Quebec, in fact, is found that it's been over harvested. So they've had to put regulations on collecting wild leek because there's just too many people collecting wild leeks. So I would not recommend anyone picking it in the wild on the Bruce Trail, because we don't want anyone to take anything other than photographs. But perhaps if you have your own woodlot and you have some wild leeks, you should have a bite and see what you think. It's actually really nice in a sandwich. And then just to quickly finish off, we're going to mention a couple of non-native species that you'll see in the spring as well. Some of them are invasive, some of them are non-native. The most abundant non-native and invasive species that we see, especially in southern Ontario, is garlic mustard. And that is a early spring plant. You know, it's sort of, by the time June comes, it's generally gone or dying. Very prolific, and it completely invades forest understories. We do have a program to try and remove garlic mustard on some of our managed land. And we'll be continuing to do that because it's a big problem. Yellow rocket, it's another species. It's in the mustard family, and it's sort of more of a agricultural waste plant. And you find it in fields and ditches, just sort of scrubby areas. Dandelions we're all familiar with. We know how widespread dandelions are. They are not native to North America. They were introduced, and they spread like wildfire. Ground ivy is another species that's been introduced, and that's takes over ground cover. It's not quite as invasive as the other species like garlic mustard. Squill, or a squib, is something that you can see generally popping up in people's front lawns. It's a introduced species from like in and around Russia, and it has these drooping purpley violet flowers that are quite distinct, but it's very short-lived. It doesn't live for longer than a couple of weeks. Colt's foot to the right looks very similar to dandelion, but it has a different shaped leaf, a big wide leaf that you can find this species generally in wetter areas, drainage ditches, beside rivers and marshes and that kind of thing. And then the last species is Dame's rocket, which is it is an invasive species. It's actually an ornamental plant that escaped from people's gardens and got out into the wild, and now it's fairly abundant all along the trail. So as I mentioned, look but don't touch. Many species take a very long time to establish, so you have to be careful about changing the balance, the balance of nature. If one person takes one wild leek, that's not going to make that much of a difference. But if 100 people take one wild leek, then it is definitely going to add up. So by picking and removing flowers, humans can cause species to struggle to retain enough energy to survive throughout the following winter. So if you're picking the leaves of a flower, then the roots may not have enough energy to grow back. So even though they might look beautiful to display in your kitchen or plant in your yard, it's best to just observe spring ephemerals in their natural habitat and to collect only photos. Better yet, take a picture and upload it to the BTC's iNaturalist project, which is iNaturalist is a website or an app that you can download. And you can take pictures of plants wherever you are, upload them, and get expert opinions on whether your identification was correct, or just to confirm what it is if you don't know what you're looking at. And if you really want to try to plant these wildflowers in your garden, you can just visit local native plant nurseries and or find seeds or cultivated plants. So we're going to move on to the questions, and Brian, I'll let you take the first page here.
Alrighty. So the first question: plants are edible. So several of these plants have been traditionally used by indigenous people, like Adam has said, but none are really known for food sources except for wild leek. And once again, like Adam said, the BTC, we do not condone the foraging of any wild plant on any of our BTC properties. Even though, you know, some people think they know how to forage properly, we just don't want to see wild plants picked from their natural environment. Which spring flower is mostly seen in the Caledon Hills area of the Bruce Trail? So we're going to say the white trillium and the trout lily are probably the most plentiful plants all along the Bruce Trail, and, you know, specifically in the Caledon Hills. That's just from our own experience. To be honest, like the blue cohash is very common in Caledon Hills. The large flower bellwort, very common. So a lot of the flowers that we just mentioned in this presentation can be seen and are common in Caledon Hills. But I always say white trillium and trout lily because they seem to be everywhere. Every forest you walk in, you'll see trilliums or trout lilies. Next question. So are there any surveys that monitor for the presence of wildflowers? So part of our job as BTC ecologists, we perform vegetation surveys all the time on all of our BTC lands. Specifically when we acquire a new property, that's part of myself and Adam's job, is we do an entire vegetation survey of the whole property. So basically we just walk through each different eco site and we write down what we see and what plants are there. And that's part of our management planning process that we do. Specifically surveys that if you have a woodlot or even in your yard, you can easily make a 1 by 1 meter square out of wood, out of 2 by 4. You put that down, and basically what you do is you count each different species within that square, and you can get a good idea of what's there and what the biodiversity is of the plants that you have there. Next question. So where the BTC has been doing tallgrass prairie restoration or meadow preservation with native grasses and native wildflowers, what happens to those plants when the natural processes of ecological succession occur, with seeds arriving from neighboring woodlands, etc. So basically, if you're gonna try to restore an area into tallgrass prairie, it's a lot more involved than just, okay, we've planted the plants, we're gonna walk away and let it do its thing. Any tallgrass prairie needs to be managed, and that is done by these controlled burns. So we get a professional company that comes in and they actually do a burn of the area, and that basically gets rid of any woody material and some of the non-native species. Or you can go in there and with a chainsaw, some pruners, and you can actually remove the woody material yourself if there's not that much of it. Because the whole idea of a tallgrass prairie, if you just let it go, eventually it will succeed into a forest. So. All right, so Adam's taking over here.
Yep, I'll take over here. So the question is picking wildflowers still a problem? And the answer is yes. Because you may not know what wildflower you're picking. Could it be a rare plant? And if it's an area that there's a lot of traffic and people are doing a lot of picking, it could actually put that species at risk. The BTC recommends that you enjoy being out in nature, but you only take away experiences and pictures. So especially during these days of heightened trail use because of this pandemic, we're seeing far more people using trails and natural spaces than ever before, which is a great thing. But we all have to be mindful of the fact that picking flowers, even if it's just one for you, is going to add up because there's 100 other people that have the same mentality or the same thought. Crocus and snowdrops are my favorite spring flowers. Are they native? No, they're not native. But I did actually see some snowdrops popping up through the soil recently, which was great. It's very exciting to see them pop up because again, it's another indicator of spring being here, which is something that I'm sure we're all happy for. I hear a puppy. What species are markers of past forest disturbance, i.e. grazing? How would I measure flower diversity in a meaningful way? Well, generally non-native species are a sign of past disturbance. So anything that you find that's introduced, dandelions, thistles, teasel, garlic mustard, those are definitely indications of disturbance. Invasive species are very good at invading areas that have been disturbed because there's no competition for them. And they can also, the seeds can be brought in fill or sort of other materials, equipment that you're bringing into an disturbed area. Flower diversity itself, though, can be measured by establishing plots and counting the different species and the amount of each species in that plot. The plot can change depending on how big of an area you actually want to look at. One interesting method, and Brian had sort of mentioned, just roping off an area and counting each individual species. One thing you can also do with that is pick one location and put a camera or your phone and take a picture a couple times a year. Make sure that it's at the exact same spot. So maybe you could even put in like a little piece of wood so you could rest your camera on top of it. So you can count all the plants in there, but you can also get a visual representation of how things are growing. And it'd make a really cool collage or something. Where's the best place in Ontario to see flowers? Well, the Bruce Trail, yeah. Anywhere that the trail goes through deciduous forest, you'll see spring ephemerals, even open in some open meadows, marshes. The flowers exist all throughout Southern Ontario along the Bruce Trail. And half the fun is going out there and figuring out what you can identify and what you're going to see that day. Perhaps you'll see something rare. So those are all the questions that we were given in advance of this webinar, but I think that there may have been a couple extras that came through as we've been talking. So I'll ask Michael to address that.
Okay, thanks, Adam and Brian, for a great presentation. And yeah, it's absolutely generated a whole bunch of really great questions. So I'll start with this first one. When a trail is being planned for a section of the BTC, do you have input as to where the trail is planned to ensure that plants are not trampled or destroyed with the trail maintenance?
That's a great question. Yeah, I'll take that one. Absolutely, yes, we do. So that is part of our job, Brian and myself. When the BTC protects a piece of property or make a conservation reserve, a nature reserve, before a trail is placed on the property, Brian and I have to inspect the proposed trail route and ensure that it does not impact any sensitive species. If there's already trail existing on the property, we inspect it and make sure that it's not impacting any sensitive species. And in some cases that has happened where we've had to move the trail significantly because we noticed a rare plant that was too close to the trail, and we don't really want to encourage people to be poaching some of these plants or just trampling them at all. So on our managed land, our conservation land, absolutely. And some other parts of the trail, it's really at the discretion of the landowner. So Conservation Authority or the Ministry of Natural Resources have their own system for allowing the trail in areas that won't impact sensitive species.
Okay, thank you, Adam. How many white trillium plants do I need to start a plant population in our woods?
What do you think, Brian?
I'll jump on that one. Once again, it's very hard to establish like a population of these native wildflowers because there's certain conditions where they grow naturally that they need. Like it's all about soil composition and specific nutrients in the soil. There's fungi in that soil that all helps. There's one big system to to allow these species to grow. But if you do have a thought of establishing a population and you have the right environment, like a deciduous woodlot, and you get your plants from a native wildflower nursery. You don't dig them up from another area. Yeah, probably 5 or 6 plants, I think, would eventually establish a population and then start spreading. But something to be reminded of is that it does take, like Trilliums and Trout Lilies, it takes about 5 to 7 years before they start producing flowers. So, once you establish your plot, you're not going to get immediate results. So you might have the leaf, but you're not going to have the flowering happen for a while.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Next question, do you encourage people picking garlic mustard along the trail? And Laura hears that it makes a delicious pesto.
Yeah, I'll answer that. So it's true, it does make a delicious pesto. That's all we have to do is market it to the right people, and we could solve this garlic mustard problem. Picking, okay, so picking is I would not recommend it outside of a sanctioned BTC project. So we do garlic mustard removal on some of our properties where we'll have events and people will come out and we're there and allowing them to go off trail, which is something that we generally do not allow people to do unless you're one of our land stewards or trail captains or volunteer. But we don't want anyone going off the trail corridor. And we're also concerned about people picking the wrong species. However, garlic mustard is pretty easy to discern. But one thing that we will be doing, and we're going to be implementing this on one of our properties in the Waterdown area, is making what's called a garlic mustard crib. So it's just essentially a big open composting container, sort of like a bunch of wood surrounded by chicken wire with very clear identifying images of garlic mustard. So in those cases, by all means, yes, you pick the garlic mustard, put it in this crib, and it turns into a big compost heap, and also condenses the seed distribution into one small area, which is much easier to manage. But picking it on your own, if you're very confident with it, you know for sure that it's garlic mustard, I would just say don't leave the trail, because we don't want to encourage anyone walking off the trail. But just be careful. If make sure you know what you're doing.
Okay, thank you. There's 2 questions here about what book would you recommend to ID wildflowers along the Bruce Trail. And as a CEO, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't plug our 30th edition of our guidebook, which is just amazing. And it does have a section on wildflowers in the beginning, a handy index. But outside of that, Brian and Adam, what books do you use and what can you recommend?
Yeah, I have a couple of books that I grabbed off my desk. So the one that we use the most, I don't know if you can see it. So that's the Peterson Wildflower Guide. So it's pretty easy to use. It basically uses flower color to differentiate the species. There's another good one that I don't have with me. It's in my backpack, and it's called Newcomb's Wildflower Guide. And it's based on leaf, leaf structure, and whether it's an alternate leaf or opposite arranged leaf. And then the third one is, this one's called Plants of Southern Ontario. And once again, it goes through and separates them by flower color and habitat. So it'll have wetland yellow flowers. So those are all really good resources. The one thing that you should be considered though is that like the spring beauties, there's a lot of flowers that look the same but they're different. So the best thing is to grab one of these field guides and get out there on the trail, and you see a flower, kneel down and try to identify it, and you'll be surprised on how quickly you'll be able to pick up wildflower species.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Here's a question about some flowers that you didn't talk about. So Joan asks, you didn't mention maidenhair ferns, herb robert, wild ginger, bird's foot, or trefoil. Are these not found along the Bruce Trail?
Oh, they are. Let me write these down. Maidenhair fern, Herb Robert,
Wild ginger,
wild ginger, yeah,
bird's foot trefoil.
bird's foot trefoil. Okay, so they're definitely found along the trail. Two of those are well, bird's foot trefoil is not native, and it's a species that you can find sort of in open fields, generally like pasture fields. Very interesting, distinct yellow flower that almost looks like it's an enclosed globe or something. Maidenhair fern, yeah, beautiful plant. There's a lot of different species that we could have added into this presentation, but for the consideration of time, we can't cover everything. Maidenhair fern is one of my favorite ferns, and I'd encourage everyone to Google it and look at a picture so that you can get an idea of what it is and see if you can find it on the trail. It has a beautiful growth form where it kind of grows in this spiral. It looks like a tiny little tree, but with this spiral tree canopy. Herb Robert, that's an interesting species. It is allegedly native. It's a native species, but it has become somewhat invasive along the Niagara Escarpment because it loves the calcium-rich dolostone of the bedrock. And you'll find Herb Robert growing pretty much everywhere in forested areas of the Niagara Escarpment. It's in the geranium species family. So it has a small sort of like purpley geranium looking flower and little fern-like leaves that have a very distinct scent to them. If you've ever crushed a Herb Robert leaf in your hand, to me it smells like cilantro, which is something I despise. So it sticks in my head. And then the last one was wild ginger, which is indeed a very a common native wildflower in Ontario, and it sort of persists throughout the year, although it does flower in the spring. Wild ginger has these flowers, these sort of crimson maroon colored flowers that sit on the ground, and they're pollinated by ants and beetles as well. And the roots actually are edible. It's a proper ginger, like the cultivated ginger that we buy in the store. However, this is the native version.
Okay, great. And I think the time, I'll ask two more quick questions, and one comes from Wanda. Do you have any initiatives that members can help with your inventory surveys?
Yeah, we have the app called iNaturalist. We have our own project on there, the BTC iNaturalist project. Excuse me. And it's very, very helpful. So basically, if you don't know what iNaturalist is, you take a picture, you download the app, you join the Bruce Trail project. So, and then you take a picture of anything. You take a picture of a mushroom, a wildflower, a bird, an insect. We collect all that data. And so basically what it does is it geo-references where you took that picture. So we know exactly where that picture was taken. And then you upload the pictures. So like an ecologist like myself or Adam, we can identify it and make sure that that's what the flower is. And iNaturalist gives you kind of like suggestions based on that picture on what it thinks the flower or the bird is. So yeah, it's very helpful with our iNaturalist app. We do, we do have volunteers who have a little bit of expertise or a high knowledge of species ID. So we have, if you're interested in volunteering to do some wildflower surveys for us, or even bird surveys, if you're a huge birder and you know your stuff, by all means, we've welcomed volunteers, and we give them some properties to go out and do surveys for us. So yeah, just contact the Bruce Trail, and if you're interested.
Okay, thanks. And I'm going to ask, I've got one last question, and then for the questions that we didn't get to, we'll make sure that the questions get to Adam and Brian, and they'll be able to get a response to you. But the last question is going to be about when we're hiking and we see an issue with plants that are too close to the trail and getting walked on, can we send you a note?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. That's an unfortunate problem that happens somewhat frequently, and again, that's something we're seeing a lot more of with the increase of usership during COVID. So typically we don't want the trail corridor in natural areas to be wider than 2 meters, a meter of width, and then half a meter on either side for a bit of a buffer zone. So if you do see trails that are sort of going off, becoming rogue or widening to much greater than is necessary, then please, give us a let us know. You can always email us at info@brucetrail.org, and we'll get back to you, and then we'll pass it along to the right people to try and fix it up.
Okay, great. So I'm sorry we're in out of time for questions. Adam and Brian, there are a lot of thank yous in here, and there's a comment in here that says, I'm so glad the BTC has talented ecologists that care for these important properties, and that's so true, and I couldn't have said it better myself. So thanks to all of you for participating today. Thanks to Adam and Brian for their expertise and their knowledge, and thanks for joining us. Get out there and enjoy some sunshine. Have a great day.